16 years old. It's supposed to be a time for school dances, summer jobs, and hanging out with friends, but for some teenagers in the US, 16 means something else entirely. Instead of classrooms, they find themselves in cold concrete cells. Instead of friends, they're surrounded by hardened criminals, men or women who've lived decades longer and who know the dark underbelly of survival. Instead of teenage dreams, they live in a nightmare of violence, abuse, and despair. On any given day, there are nearly 60,000 incarcerated teens in US prisons and juvenile detention centers. These could be for an array of reasons, but the consequences of teenagers being imprisoned in adult jails are often horrendous, hindering social, academic, and emotional development to the point where there's no coming back. Problems usually start much earlier. 3.3 million teenagers are now expelled or suspended from school each year in the United States, many of whom fall into the notorious school-to-prison pipeline. It's a black hole that many fall into and never emerge from. So how does a teenager, someone not even old enough to vote, end up in an adult prison in the first place? Well, it all started in the 1990s, a time when a fear of rising crime gripped the United States. Politicians and the media warned of a new breed of violent youth offenders, labeling them super predators, a term coined to describe teenagers who were supposedly so cold, so remorseless, that they were beyond redemption. The public bought into this myth, and lawmakers reacted swiftly. Suddenly, across the country, states began passing laws that made it easier to try teenagers as adults, especially for serious crimes like murder, assault, or armed robbery. The rationale was simple. If you do the crime, you do the time, no matter how old you are. Now, the problem with that idea is that it was built on a false narrative. The super predator panic never materialized, and research has since debunked the myth, but the damage was done. The laws were already in place, allowing kids as young as 13 or 14 to be tried and sentenced as adults. And often, we're talking about low-level non-violent crime here, with 74% of all juveniles in custody held for non-violent crimes, which include property crimes, drug offenses, technical violations of probation, and public order offenses. Now, boys make up the vast majority of the incarcerated juvenile population. 85% of those in custody are male. However, the number of incarcerated girls has been rising, especially for drug offenses. In many states, whether or not a teenager is tried as an adult is left to the discretion of prosecutors. That means a 15-year-old who steals a car might end up in juvenile detention in one state, while another in a different state or under a harsher prosecutor could be sentenced to decades in an adult prison. There's no consistency, and the consequences are devastating. Every year, thousands of teenagers are tried as adults in the US, and an alarming number of them end up in adult prisons. Many of them are teenagers who've never had a second chance, thrown into a world designed for the most violent of offenders. And look, it's no surprise that racial disparities run deep in this system. African American and Hispanic teenagers are far more likely to be tried as adults than their white peers. While black youth make up about 14% of the US juvenile population, they account for 42% of all juvenile arrests and 52% of all cases that result in residential placement. The reasons behind this are complex, tied to systematic racism, over-policing in minority communities, and socioeconomic disparities. But the result is the same. A disproportionate number of minority teenagers are paying the price in a system that has set them up to fail. And once those kids are in the adult system, the focus is no longer on rehabilitation. Juvenile detention, for all of its flaws, at least tries to help teens reform and reintegrate. The adult system is just often all about punishment. There are few programs or pathways out. It's a sink or swim environment. And for a 16-year-old, that usually means drowning in a sea of violence and abuse. Prisons are brutal environments for anyone, but for teenagers, the stakes are even higher. These are kids who have barely begun to understand the world, let alone navigate the complexities of violence, power dynamics, and sheer terror that are a part of everyday life in adult facilities. Teenagers in adult prisons are unsurprisingly incredibly vulnerable. They're seen as easy targets by older, more seasoned inmates. These kids often face daily harassment, physical assaults, and in many cases something even more horrifying, sexual violence. And it's not a small problem either. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, teenagers in adult prisons are 5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than their peers in juvenile detention centers. These teens are often left with scars that last far longer than their sentences. And it's not just sexual violence they face. Physical violence is rampant in adult prisons. These teenagers, who may be in jail for non-violent offenses, are housed alongside hardened criminals, many of whom see them as easy prey. The fights aren't just about survival, they're often about dominance, power, and control. A 15-year-old locked up with 35-year-old gang members is not a fair fight, or a fight these kids can afford to lose. Let's take the case of Khalif Browder. At just 16 years old, Khalif was arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack. He was sent to Rikers Island, one of the most notorious prisons in the United States, where he spent 3 years with 800 days in solitary confinement waiting for a trial that never happened. During those 3 years, Khalif was repeatedly assaulted by both inmates and guards. He was isolated, beaten down, and psychologically tormented. The weight of that trauma stayed with Khalif even after his release. He struggled with depression, and the scars from his time in Rikers ran deep. In 2015, just 2 years after being released, Khalif took his own life. His death wasn't just a tragic ending, it was a consequence of a system that had failed him at every level. And Khalif's story isn't unique. Thousands of teenagers across the US are living similar nightmares. Even if they survive the physical violence, the psychological toll is undeniable. These kids are thrust into environments where they are just not equipped to cope, and they're expected to just make it through. The fear, the isolation, and the constant threat of harm can lead to lasting mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and PTSD. The juvenile justice system in the US was built on one foundational idea: rehabilitation. It recognizes that teenagers are still physically and mentally developing, and that they're more capable of change than adults. The brain of a 16-year-old is not the brain of a 30-year-old. Neuroscience has shown that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making and impulse control, doesn't fully develop until well into a person's 20s. Teenagers are impulsive, emotional, and prone to making bad decisions, not because they're inherently bad, but because their brains are still wired for risk-taking. The juvenile system takes this into account. It focuses on reform and not punishment. Juvenile detention centers offer programs aimed at helping teenagers turn their lives around, things like counseling, education, vocational training, and behavioral therapy. The goal is to get these kids back on track, teach them how to cope with their mistakes, and give them the tools that they need to succeed when they're released. And look, it might not always be a successful system, and there are plenty of horror stories, but it is important to make the distinction from adult prisons. The philosophy of the adult prison system is entirely different. The focus is on punishment and deterrence. The idea is that by locking someone up, you're preventing them from committing further crimes and sending a message to society that crime doesn't pay. However, this approach is fundamentally flawed when applied to teenagers. Adult prisons are not designed to help inmates grow or change. There are precious few programs specifically tailored to teenagers, and the harsh reality is that once a teenager is thrown into an adult prison, they're treated like every other inmate. There's no recognition of their age, no consideration of their emotional and mental development. They are expected to fend for themselves in an environment that was not built for them. Even worse, many adult prisons don't have educational programs for younger inmates. Many of these teenagers were already struggling in school and are now being deprived of an education. Instead of learning how to turn their lives around, they're being left to rot in cells where they'll emerge with fewer skills than when they went in. Without the support systems in place that are found in juvenile detention centers, these teens are left to navigate the adult prison system on their own. The result, instead of reforming, they learn how to survive in the criminal underworld. They're exposed to older inmates who may be part of gangs or who can teach them how to commit more serious crimes. This lack of intervention and education means these teens often come out of prison more dangerous than when they went in. And it's not just their time in prison that's at stake here, it's their future. Once a teenager is tried as an adult, they're often given a permanent criminal record. This follows them for the rest of their lives, making it incredibly difficult to find work, secure housing, or even continue their education. The system sets them up for failure before they've even had a chance to start. One of the most alarming outcomes of incarcerating teenagers in adult prisons is the high recidivism rates. You'd think that placing a teenager in such a harsh environment might scare them straight. I mean, that's the logic behind the tough-on-crime approach, but the reality couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, research shows that teens incarcerated in adult facilities are significantly more likely to reoffend than those who go through the juvenile system. Being thrown into an environment where survival often means becoming harder, more violent, and more entrenched in criminal behavior only perpetrates the cycle of crime. When a teenager gets out of prison after serving alongside adult offenders, they're not coming out with life skills or a sense of redemption. They're coming out angrier, traumatized, and more likely to reoffend because they've been immersed in a culture of violence, manipulation, and criminal expertise. The role models they've had in prison are other criminals, people who have spent years honing their skills in the underworld. Instead of learning from their mistakes. These teens are learning from the worst society offers. And let's not forget the lifelong stigma that follows these kids. Once you're tried as an adult, you're marked for life. A criminal record for a 17-year-old, especially for a serious offense, can destroy any chance they have of leading an everyday life once they're released. Employers don't want to hire them. Schools often won't accept them. Housing options become limited and social services are scarce. For many, their only option is to return to the same environment that got them in trouble in the first place. Take the case of Curtis Fairchild Jones. Curtis, along with his sister, was sentenced to life in prison at the age of 12 for murder. He became the youngest person in the US to receive such a sentence. Curtis was not a hardened criminal. He was a child, caught in a whirlwind of emotions and terrible decisions. After being incarcerated for over 20 years, he was finally released, but the life that he had known was gone. He spent the entirety of his formative years in a cage, surrounded by men far older and far more dangerous than him. How could anyone expect him to reintegrate into society after that? The psychological trauma these teens endure is another aspect that haunts them long after they leave prison. The constant fear, the violence, and the isolation they face inside leaves them with deep emotional scars. Many develop PSD, as we said, from experiences they've had, whether it's from being beaten, sexually assaulted, or even just witnessing the brutality that unfolds around them daily. Studies estimate that 70% of youths in the juvenile justice system have a diagnosable mental health condition, and many do not receive adequate care while in detention. Now, despite the darkness of this story, there's still a glimmer of hope. Across the United States, advocates, activists, and even lawmakers are fighting to change the system, to prevent more teenagers from being thrown into adult prisons and to give them a chance of rehabilitation instead of punishment. In recent years, there has been a growing awareness of just how harmful it is to incarcerate teenagers in adult facilities. Thanks to the efforts of organizations like Campaign for Youth Justice and the Equal Justice Initiative, some states have begun to take steps towards reform. They've recognized that teenagers are different from adults, that their brains are still developing, and that they deserve a second chance. One of the most promising areas of reform has been raising the age at which teens can be tried as adults. In states like New York and California, reforms have passed that ensure fewer teenagers are sent to adult prisons. In New York, for example, the Raise the Age legislation was passed in 2017, ensuring that 16 and 17-year-olds would no longer automatically be tried as adults in the criminal justice system. This was a major victory for advocates fighting for years to stop the state from sentencing teenagers to adult time. California has also made significant strides, passing laws that prevent most teenagers from being tried as adults and ensuring that even those who commit serious crimes are given the chance of rehabilitation within the justice system. These reforms are based on a growing body of research that shows teenagers can and do change, that given the right environments, they can reform, learn from their mistakes, and go on to lead productive lives. In general, things are going in the right direction. Teenage numbers in adult prisons have plummeted since the mid-1990s when it hit an all-time high. Between 1999 and 2019, the number of youth in detention dropped by 66%, but it's not always evenly distributed. Wyoming, South Dakota, and Nebraska have the highest rates of teen incarceration, while North Carolina, Connecticut, and Vermont have the lowest. And as we mentioned earlier, the color of your skin also significantly affects the likelihood of you ending up in jail. Despite the progress, countless teenagers are still falling through the system's cracks. Many states still allow prosecutors to decide whether to try teenagers as adults, and in some cases, the laws are so broad that even 13-year-olds can be sentenced to adult time. The political and public perception hurdles are significant. Many people still believe that if you do the crime, you do the time, no matter how young you are. They argue that if a teenager commits a serious crime, they should face serious consequences, even if that means being locked up in an adult facility. But this mindset ignores the fact that these teenagers are still children with undeveloped brains and the potential for change. And in any case, it's not working. Recidivism rates among juveniles are high. Nearly 50% of juveniles released from custody are rearrested within a year, and 75% are rearrested within 3. Those are some poor figures, considering that it costs between $23,000 and $307,000 to house a single inmate in the United States. Now, we could talk about the broader failures of westernized prison systems, but today we're focusing on teenagers. And for teenagers who haven't even fully formed yet, throwing them into an adult prison can be akin to a life sentence, even if the actual sentence might be much lower. The criminalization, PTSD, loss of education, and position as a social pariah when they emerge means that the likelihood of ever being able to play out those dreams they had as a teenager is simply slim to none.